Okay, everyone, it's the top of the hour, 4 o'clock here at Sonoma State. Welcome, students. Welcome, members of the Alliance, our guests online. We have another big crowd from SRJC here today. This talk is truly one of the highlights of the semester, and judging from student evaluations of teaching effectiveness, one of the highlights of entire careers at Sonoma State. So I have the honor of introducing our speakers. And I'll start with our superstar, Rena Victor, who is sitting over here. Rena Victor is a retired preschool teacher who was born in Hamburg, Germany. Her mother lost her entire immediate and extended family except for one cousin in the Holocaust. After fleeing the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, she went into hiding with her mother and two sisters for 2 years until the war ended in 1945. She was not able to leave Germany until 1951. Her non-Jewish father was drafted into the German army and worked for the underground to try to save Jews. Rena later married another Holocaust survivor. While she believes each survivor's story is unique, being a child of a mixed marriage gives her a unique perspective. Standing right here at the podium with me is Dr. Susan Victor. She is Professor Emerita in the Department of Curriculum Studies and Secondary Education at Sonoma State, where she has taught adolescent development and classroom management to future middle and high school teachers for 24 years, probably 25 this year. Prior to that, she taught in the Department of Secondary Education at San Francisco State for 9 years. Earlier in her teaching career, she taught high school German. Susan did not hear about her family's experiences until she was in her 20s. She is on the board of the Alliance and chairs the Alliance's Education Committee. And then joining us is the third generation. Davita Lesch, who is a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the Wright Institute in Berkeley. She will be graduating with her doctorate degree in clinical psychology this June. She currently works at Napa State Hospital as a clinical psychology intern. Davita is also an associate board member for the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, and currently leads the 3G, that's third generation group, for the Alliance. Okay, so we're going to fiddle a little bit here with the technology, and then we're going to turn it over to our speakers. Bear with me. Play.
Hello. First, I want to say that Davita and my mother and I did not send each other messages about wearing accidental. But maybe there's an unconscious decision there that I'll just let you think about. Jonathan Glazer was the director of a film called The Zone of Interest. It was a film that depicted Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss living with his family in a lovely home next to the camp. When he accepted the award for Best International Film at the Academy Awards, he said in his speech, "We refute our Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation led to conflict and dehumanization of so many people." You have a chance to read the whole speech. It was met with a lot of criticism from Jewish people and Jewish groups, which confused me because at the time I thought his words really spoke to me, and I still do. I think they probably misunderstood them. We three are here today to actually offer you 4 generations stories about the Holocaust. I say 4 because we bring my grandmother, my mother's mother, wherever we go when we do this. Her voices and her voice and her story is with the 3 of us. The 3 of us will tell you a story, survivor, daughter, as we wrestle with what in German is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The German language is so beautiful and so rich with compound nouns, if you're into grammar. And this literally translates to Bewältigung is to come to the act of coming to terms with. And Vergangenheit, if you know any German, means the past. My mother's going to start.
Good afternoon, everybody. What is it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Rena Victor. I'm honored to speak again at the lecture series. I live in Marin County and I'm a retired preschool teacher. I left Germany in 1951 after surviving the Holocaust and 6 years of post-war reconstruction in Germany. I'm here to tell you the story of my family surviving the Holocaust in Germany. Since I was a young child during that time, and my recollections and memories may be mixed with what my mother told me. I know you heard another survivor's story last week. It is important to remember that every survivor has a unique story, and every survivor experienced the aftermath differently. I have had the honor of speaking to hundreds of students in grades 5 through 12 and college over the last 17 years. I try to connect my story to what students are reading or learning and to their own lives in the hopes that they will stand up to racism and anti-Semitism. I expect you are familiar with the events leading up to the Holocaust, how Hitler came to power and the history and nature of anti-Semitism in Germany. As you know, there were essentially two wars going on in Germany, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war with the Jews. My story takes place in this context. The experience of German Jews was unique, as this quote from Yad Vashem describes. German Jews defined themselves as both Germans and Jews. Life under Nazi rule thrust most of the Jewish population into a severe identity crisis. Germany, the homeland whose values and culture the Jews had adopted, was rejecting them. We, myself, my daughter, and my grandchildren feel both German and Jewish, but it became a complex identity, obviously, after the Holocaust, and in a sense, an identity that no longer exists in Germany. We are comfortable speaking and hearing the German language, unlike most survivors of children or children of survivors. And we have returned to Germany several times, although those trips are never easy. First, a history or a reminder of the events leading up to the Holocaust. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany after consolidating the roles of President and Chancellor. 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. These laws, as you know, severely limited the rights of Jewish people and how Jewish people could live their lives. First and most significant, the citizenship was taken. Jewish people could at first only go out, for example, to the market at certain times. There was a curfew just for Jews. They had to go to the back of lines. They had to give up driver's licenses. They couldn't be doctors or lawyers or teachers or hold any kind of public job. They couldn't marry non-Jews. They couldn't even have pets. They couldn't go to school. They weren't allowed to walk on the sidewalk. And eventually, they couldn't keep their homes or belongings, and were forced to move in with other Jewish people, often complete strangers. These places were referred to as Judenhäuser, or Jewish houses. It was a temporary method of marginalizing and segregating and ghettoizing Jews in Germany. November 9th, 1938 came Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass, the night when Nazis smashed windows, stores in Jewish neighborhoods, destroying approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses and hundreds of temples in Germany and Austria. Many people were taken away, including thousands of Jewish adult men ages 16 to 60. It marked the beginning of the end for German Jews. In March of 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. I was born 2 months after the war started in November of 1939. Here's some background about me that is important for you to know. I was born in Hamburg, which is, as you might know, a large harbor city in northern Germany. My mother was Jewish, my father was not. They married in June of 1935, just before the Nuremberg Law was enacted, which would prohibit their marriage. I almost died as an infant, and the Nazi doctor told my father to just let me die and my father threw him out of the house. I had 2 older sisters, pictures of whom you saw on the first slide. My father owned a grocery store in a Jewish neighborhood, Viertel in Hamburg. The store was vandalized by the Nazis, who painted graffiti on it like, "Don't shop in Jewish stores." The tires on his delivery truck were slashed. He was called to the Gestapo after he physically stopped the Hitler youth from vandalizing his store and was given 14 days to close it. Friends started avoiding my mother. They crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. A close friend since childhood all of a sudden stopped talking to her. Her circle of friends diminished or became non-existent. One time, some Hitler youth harassed her and her mother, calling them terrible things. My grandmother, who was a very proper lady, swore back at them, shocking my mother. She said, "Man muss mit ihnen reden in der Sprache, die sie verstehen." In other words, one has to speak to them in a language they understand. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandfather had strong feelings that Jewish people should assimilate, should be able to live wherever they chose to. Apparently, he would approach Orthodox Jews and ask them not to be in public in their religious clothing so that they wouldn't stand out. He committed, was just really worried about them. Tragically, he committed suicide 10 years before the war started. My uncle was still in public school where students sang terrible songs about Jews. Das Judenblut von Messer. Translators, when the Jewish blood springs from the knife. Couldn't be more good. No. But he was forced to leave and attend a Jewish school. Eventually, in 1942, that school was closed. An SS sign shows the students were deported and the principal and all the teachers murdered by the Nazis. This is a picture of the Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, placed in front of the school for the principal and teachers. I will talk more about these later. We were then very, very worried about the safety of my grandmother and uncles. They were forced to leave their apartment. The Nazis confiscated the apartment and all their belongings, and they came to live with us. My father, who was a German soldier by this time, thought he could protect my grandmother and my uncle. But eventually the Nazis took them away in November of 1941. My uncle was only 20 years old. From the information we gathered, we learned that they were gassed in a truck on the way to Minsk in Russia. Tragically, his girlfriend's family was able to leave to the United States and had wanted to take him with him, but he wouldn't leave his mother and sister. This slide shows a documentation of their deportation and deaths from Yad Vashem database, where we were able to conduct research. My father had to join the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. Again, to remind you, there were two wars going on, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war on the Jews and many others. Like many or most non-Jewish men, my father was drafted. During his time as a soldier, he helped during his time as a soldier, he helped in the underground or resistance by getting the names and addresses of Jewish people whom the Nazis were going to pick up. Because he was in the Air Force, he actually had to fly Nazis. There's a story about getting the Nazi generals drunk and his friend, an artist, painting their portraits. My father was then able to get more secret information so that he could protect more Jews. He had a small book with notes of this information. One time he dropped it in a hotel room. A maid found it and returned it to him. He could have easily been arrested and killed by the Nazis if she had turned him in. He was arrested once in Belgium and beaten for information, but was released due to lack of evidence. He had also been arrested or summoned previous times and told he had to divorce my mother. The injuries he endured in prison affected him his whole life and probably contributed to his death in his early 70s. Two of his brothers were also involved in the underground and were killed by the Nazis. This slide shows my father in uniform at the graveside of one of his brothers, as well as a portrait the painter did of my father. After the war, my father was involved with the efforts to track down Nazis. One day in 1943, my mother was summoned by the Gestapo to come to the Rathaus, City Hall. This probably happened multiple times. She was told by the SS officer that they had a letter from my father that he wanted to divorce her because he didn't want to be married to a Jew anymore. My mother knew they were lying and said, I have to see that letter for myself. The SS officer claimed he didn't have it, but he would get it. But in the meantime, she would have to stay at City Hall and clean all the floors. Every time she was summoned, she brought me and my sisters with her, this time as well. So she responded she couldn't clean the floors because she had her children to watch. The officer said something like they would watch the children, which was, of course, very frightening. My mother then took out her right hand of her pocket in a hand on which she had only two fingers because the three had been lost in an accident and she was 3 years old, and essentially shoved the hand into the officer's face, saying that she couldn't clean the floors because of this injury. The Nazi officer may have been shocked, or maybe he felt sympathetic, but he let her go. Hamburg was bombed by the Allied forces for 10 days and nights during Operation Gomorrah. To survive the bombing, we had to go into a bomb shelter, which was typically in the basement of an apartment building, like the one we lived in. Every bomb shelter had a Gauleiter or area leader. He was willing, this Gauleiter would not let my mother into the bomb shelter because she was Jewish. He was willing to allow the three of us in because our father was a German soldier. The night we were bombed out, the neighbors in the apartment building essentially forced him to let my mother in. We don't know for sure how, but they either beat him up or killed him. Before fleeing our demolished apartment building, my mother threw her identification papers, which showed she was Jewish, and the yellow star Jews were forced to wear, into the fire. As Hamburg was burning, we were evacuated by train with almost 1 million other people to Hof, a small town in Bavaria in southern Germany. As we fled, my mother carrying me and holding the hand of my sister, and one bag which contained a change of clothing and some photographs, The woman offered to carry the bag. We don't know if she took it or it was lost in the crowd of people running, but that was the last we saw of it. All we had left were the clothes we were wearing. We do have the watch and bracelet she was wearing when we fled. When we arrived in Hove, we were herded into a big school gym where the residents of the town could look at us and decide to whom to offer shelter. We lived in the attic of a Nazi woman who thought she was sheltering the family of a soldier. This was incredibly scary for my mother, as the woman had no idea that she was Jewish. She had to lie, for example, when the woman wanted her to come downstairs and listen to Hitler speak on the radio. She would say, "Sie müssen kommen, der Führer spricht." My mother sent letters to everyone she knew in Hamburg in the hopes my father would find us and realize we were alive, that we had survived the bombing. She also sent him a telegram. We are fortunate to have the original copies of these documents, which you see in this slide. In the meantime, my father returned to Hamburg to find our apartment building destroyed. He left this note on the building: "Who knows where my family is?" These pictures are in a book about the Jews from Hamburg. He ran into one of the friends who got a letter from my mother and let him know where we were. He was able to get a leave and came to Hove. Then, after securing a hiding place with friends who lived on a farm outside of Hamburg, sent my mother a telegram instructing her to come back to return. Because the trains were not running on any kind of a schedule, my mother took us to the station every day until we could get back on a train to Hamburg. We realized then that it was no longer safe for us and we had to go into hiding. My father's friends had a farm in Meindorf, Allstate, outside of Hamburg. They were hiding political prisoners from the Nazis. Here we stayed for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945. We lived in a shack that my father was able to send because he was in charge of securing, setting up prefabricated buildings and finding houses for soldiers. For those 2 years, we had no water, no heat, no electricity. My mother and the old elderly man who lived on the farm helped make beds for us, and she sewed sheets together and pillows she stuffed with hay. I remember we had to sleep in our shoes, and always someone had to be on the lookout for the Gestapo. The friends never told the neighbors that my mother was hidden there, only that they were taking care of 3 children of a German soldier. My mother could never risk leaving the farm. I'm not sure how we got food, but we were able to plant some vegetables, and the woman got us children some food with ration cards. My father may have sent some coffee he got on the black market, which the woman was able to trade or sell for food. My sisters walked to a well for water. By the end of the war, we were quite malnourished and thin. They also raked electricity from the main house, and mother listened secretly to the radio so she could follow the war news, which was, of course, very dangerous. In April of 1945, we hear Hitler had died. The war will be over soon, and we know the war will be over soon. Suddenly, one day, my father came. He startled us. We didn't recognize him. We moved to Hamburg and lived together until we emigrated. Hamburg was almost totally destroyed by the bombing, so it was very hard to find somewhere to live. We lived with other survivors, then with a close friend of my mother's. For a short time, we were given a house to live in that the Nazis had taken from a Jewish family who never returned. I'm not sure where else, but several places with several people. Every day, my mother listened to the radio because they would read the names of the survivors of the concentration camps. She desperately listened for any family member, but heard only one cousin's name. Later, my mother will realize only she and this one cousin survived. More than 50 members of the family were killed by the Nazis. One day, walking through the rubble, she met a friend of her brother who told her where and how her brother died. This friend had been in Buchenwald. She also once heard the name of a friend who was the daughter of the principal at the Jewish school I had mentioned earlier. The Jewish school from which all the teachers and principal were killed. My parents went together to pick up this friend from Dachau concentration camp, where she had been and where both her parents were killed. We were very poor and had nothing after the war. Also, the anti-Semitism persisted. My oldest sister, who had returned to school, even heard it from teachers. People looked at us and wondered and even asked why or how we survived. The same friends who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw my mother coming now tried to convince her to sign papers claiming that they had not supported the Nazis, which she refused to do. Because our parents had no money and had to get their lives together, we three sisters were moved into a home provided by the Warburg family. The Warburgs were a German Jewish family living in the United States who donated their home in a neighborhood north of Hamburg for Jewish orphans and children who had survived the war but maybe had no family, or the family had no money or stable home like us. This gave me and my sisters shelter and food and a community and a safe place to be Jewish. While my sisters and I were in the children's home, my mother, who was now on her own, works desperately every day on immigration to America. It was awful for her to live in Hamburg those 6 years, not only because of all the bombed out rooms everywhere, but because she was always looking over her shoulder, afraid and wondering if that person was a Nazi and had killed her mother and brother. These are pictures in a notebook in which you can see some of her most notes about leaving. My mother was an incredibly resilient and brave woman. Here are 2 stories that illustrate that. One day she was driving and was stopped by a police officer who asked to see her for her license, which she didn't have. And she said to the officer, "At the start of the war, the Nazis took my license from me. Now I'm waiting for them to give it back." He let her go. She also refused to wait in line. For example, once at a post office, she went to the front of the line. When people complained, she said, "At the start of the war, you didn't allow me, as a Jew, to stand in line with you. Now I refuse to stand in line with you." It was something she unfortunately continued to do here.
It was embarrassing as a child.
In order to get to America, like now, people had to have a sponsor, a family or friends in the United States who would provide an affidavit of financial support. It took a long time and effort to convince relatives in Illinois to provide that. My mother had an uncle, her father's brother, who had been willing, but sadly he died then. His 3 sons weren't so sure. Finally, one agreed to sponsor us, but only if my mother brought only one daughter. I was the youngest, so my mother made the devastating decision to leave my 2 older sisters. It was very, very hard to leave my sisters and my father, who also remained in Hamburg. One sister came a year later, but the other not for 4 years. My father did not want my middle sister to come. I did not see my father again until I was 31, and my daughter was 11, which was the age I was when I left. This slide shows a picture taken of me with my parents and Susan, who was the age I was when I last saw my father. It was the only time I saw my father in 31 years. He came to visit us in early 1970. He died shortly after this visit. The feeling associated with this separation never left me or my sisters. This separation was something we never fully healed from. We immigrated to the United States with tickets paid for partly by the relatives in Illinois. It was not easy here either. I had to confront prejudice against Germans when they heard my accent, anti-Semitism along with the racism faced by African Americans. There were signs by public schools in New York, for example, that read, "No Negroes, Jews, or dogs allowed." My mother had to quickly find work, but she also faced anti-Semitism. She could not get hired by several insurance companies like Allstate or Farmers, for example. I had to go to public school not understanding or speaking any English, and no teachers prepared to support the needs of refugee students rather. A few years later, we moved to Southern California, where I attended high school and then married another survivor and had 2 children. This is a picture of my mother's immediate and extended family at a wedding in 1922. We got this picture from a cousin in Illinois. My mother could not tolerate it, having it in her apartment. It was just too painful a reminder. Only 2 family members in this picture survived. As I told you earlier, only my mother and 1 cousin. The picture has hung in Susan's house since her wedding in 1991. Germany has taken responsibility and made efforts to make the history of the Holocaust public, to display reminders outside where everyone can see. The Stolpersteine can be seen as an example. There are currently more than 90,000 of these stumbling stones that you see in this slide in 1,200 locations in 30 countries for victims of the Nazis. They are small brass flags on top of cement blocks installed on the sidewalk or driveway of the last known residents of the victims. My sister and I had 2 placed for our grandmother and uncle. Every time we or my daughter and grandchildren go to Hamburg, we visit the Stolpersteine. In fall of 2021, a stumbling stone was installed for my first husband's grandmother, with whom he was close as a child. My grandson, Micah, began to do the research during his last year of college in 2017 to have this Stolperstein installed. The pandemic led to delay, but in 2022, Susan and her son went to Berlin to see it. The artist, Günther Demnig, says the goal is to recover the humanity and identity of victims by placing the stones on their last known residents. He also explains how important it is for young people to know and remember the history by seeing it everywhere. To remember that even in the land of Dichter und Denker, poets and thinkers, this could happen. The social justice lawyer, Brian Stevenson, talks about the Stolpersteine as a partial inspiration for the lynching memorial in Alabama. There are other public memorials throughout Germany, like the railroad tracks listing deportations and signs on stores that have been owned by Jewish people prior to the war. Unlike most survivors, I have returned to Germany a few times, as I mentioned earlier. I have some non-Jewish cousins still there, and as a German Jew, I still speak German, as I mentioned earlier, although it is getting It is upsetting that sometimes Jewish people get uncomfortable when they hear my accent or hear me speak German. I still feel somewhat connected to Hamburg, although I would never live there again. I have been invited to speak to high school students in Germany, in Hamburg and in Leer, where my father was born, to students who had never met a Jewish person. I more recently returned to Hamburg in October of 2022, exactly 100 years since that wedding picture was taken. Here's a picture of my cousin and I visiting the Stolpersteine. It is not easy for these cousins to talk about what happened to us, so his coming with me was very significant and important. This quote from Elie Wiesel explains what the Holocaust and my experience means today, why I talk to students, and why my daughter and grandchildren know and help me share my story. I ask students of all ages to please consider how the Holocaust is relevant to their education and to lives today, and how racism and anti-Semitism, prejudice, scapegoating against immigrants, Asian Americans, Muslims, gay, and transgender people are present in our lives today, not only in person, but on the internet. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do questions at the end. Transition from my mother's story to mine. I wanted you to see some numbers. Before the Holocaust, there were 17,000 Jews living in Hamburg, significant population. 2,148 Jews were taken in 1941, along with my mother's grandmother and uncle, transport to Minsk. They were gassed, as she said, in the truck on the way to Minsk. 1,800 Jews were then left in 1941 in Hamburg, most of them in mixed marriages. My mother's parents. 7,800 Jewish people from Hamburg were killed by the Nazis. 106,000 Jewish people and political prisoners were held in a prison and concentration camp called Fußbüttel in Hamburg, and the satellite camp of Neuengamme, which was located near Hamburg. More than half of these prisoners were killed. Fortunately, one of the survivors became Rena's future husband and my father. At the end of the Holocaust, at the end of the war, there were 1,268 Jewish people left in Hamburg, including her two sisters, my grandmother, and the one cousin.
Excuse me, Susan, can you speak up more?
Yeah, do you want me to use a microphone?
Yes.
I have only two hands, so I'm trying to figure out how to do that. So my name is Susan Victor, as Stephen told you. I've been a professor at this wonderful university in the School of Education for 24 years. I actually retired at the end of 2023, but they somehow don't let you ever leave. I'm trying to figure out why that is, but
It's like Hotel California.
it is. It's like a weird cult or something. Anyway, I still teach a class or two. I just have a really hard time not being a professor anymore. So wonderful. And currently I chair the education committee for the Lions, as Stephen told you. What that means primarily is that I keep telling the speakers, this is just such a great retirement gig. I get to prepare and schedule speakers, Jewish and Armenian, for presentations in middle and high schools in Sonoma and surrounding counties. I'm just going to give you a little plug. Last year, we reached 3,100 middle and high school students. So we're really proud of what we do. But what I'm talking to you about today, as I follow my mother and the amazing story she told you, is not the identity I brought to my work here the last 24 years, at least not explicitly. I was really busy being a professor, several students, and a parent of two. I would often see the lecture series posters and think, I should be part of that probably, but somehow I had to keep it at a distance. I told myself I didn't have time and it wasn't why I was here anyway. But it was, and it's still hard, honestly, to bring the deeply personal thing I'm about to tell you to this place. The photos of me on this slide are from my first 5 trips. I'm sorry, I have a really hard time getting through this without crying, so I'm gonna look at it. Are from my first 5 trips to Hamburg, starting from age 16 to age 23. I was asked by my father, who could never return to Germany, to visit his mother, who was not Jewish and had remained in Hamburg. I would spend most of the 3 weeks I was there sitting at my grandmother's bedside, as for various unexplained medical reasons, she had taken to her bed in her 60s, usually fully dressed and in shoes. As someone who teaches about identity development in adolescence, it's clear to me that these trips cemented an identity for me, in me, with that place, with Hamburg. Hence the title of the slide, Mein zweites Heimat, my second home. Germany, the identity that was available to me, because as you looked at those numbers on the previous slide, the German Jewish identity really no longer existed. My story as a daughter of Holocaust survivors begins with 2 conversations. One with my grandmother, my mother's mother, and the other with my father, who was a survivor of imprisonment and forced labor in the Neuengamme concentration camp. The first conversation takes place when I'm 12 years old and I'm sitting on the kitchen counter and watching my grandmother cook dinner while we wait for my parents to come home from work. Warum denkst du, kommen sie so spät? She asked me. Why do you think they're coming so late? Referring to my parents, speaking German to me for the first time in my life. Well, that was the start of my lessons, and not just of German. Prior to that, I had at times heard she and my mother speak German, never my father. Beyond what I can remember, mentioning a favorite street in Berlin called Unter den Linden, or an occasional random phrase he would say. Like when he sat down and he was tired, he would say, Der Singer sitzt, the singer is sitting. But he never really spoke the language anymore. Prior to that, where am I? 4 years later came the first trip to Hamburg at the age of 16 with my maternal grandmother, whom you just heard about from my mother. I reflect how confusing it was to look at my grandmother's face, alternatively anger and fear and panic. We had come to Hamburg to move my paternal grandmother into assisted living. They were very close friends before before the war started. As my mother mentioned in her slide, my 2 grandmothers were close friends, and that friendship required that my maternal grandmother make the trip she never wanted to make, to return to Germany. That trip was followed by 4 more I had to take alone throughout my adolescence and college years to see my father's mother, because he never dared to return to Germany. His mother was not Jewish, as I said, and was actually the daughter, interestingly, of Adolf Schoenfelder, who was earlier the mayor of Hamburg and then president of the Senate after the war. This is a picture of him with Konrad Adenauer meeting Queen Elizabeth. Believe it or not. I always wondered, but was never told, why my father never went to visit his mother. As summer would approach, he would ask me, will you go visit my mother? Which of course I could not say no to, despite my 20-something self sensing it was maybe more of a sacrifice than I allowed myself to feel. My father's father, who was a somewhat well-known communist Jewish writer, fled Germany for Switzerland and then New York, abandoning his half-Jewish sons at ages 10 and 12. I studied German for 9 years in high school and college, including a class about the writer Heinrich Heine, in which the professor, who had read my grandfather's books, was noticeably thrilled as he read my last name. The C I got in that class was mortifying. I didn't understand anything. I developed a bond with Hamburg as mein zweites Heimat over those 4 trips alone. None of my relatives in Hamburg ever spoke to me or my family about me or my family being Jewish or about the Holocaust. At home, nobody did either. We celebrated Christmas and Easter. My father watched World War II movies. He seemed to suffer many health problems, including the inability to eat anything that had fat in it.
butter, meat fat, the yellow of eggs. He often looked distant and preoccupied. My 8th grade US history teacher showed us slides of the concentration camps. I remember one with piles of shoes and glasses. I also remember feeling like there was a spotlight on me, but I didn't know why. The year I turned 23, the other conversation takes place. My father was diagnosed with cancer, and knowing I assumed that he wouldn't have long to live, sat me on the couch and in what I recall as a 10-minute conversation, told me about the circumstances of leaving Germany. His primary motivation in telling me was concern that his brother, whom he didn't entirely trust, and others would distort the truth. I remember very little content of that conversation, but recall feeling immobile with the seriousness of it. He didn't talk to me too much. And seeing the stunned and worried faces of my mother and grandmother, I think my mother said, "You're telling her this?" He died a year or so later, 1 month before his 60th birthday and 2 weeks after my 25th, exactly 40 years ago this month. The threads that follow from these two conversations tells you what it means to me to be a daughter of German Jewish Holocaust survivors. My mother and her mother's story became an integrated, increasingly cohesive part of my personal and professional identity. It coalesced into a purpose I can hold on to as an educator. I became a German teacher in the 1980s. I faced a student who defined as a neo-Nazi in my first year. He drew swastikas on his work. When I asked him why he was taking German, he answered, "To learn the language of the master race." In his evaluation of my teaching that you see on this slide, the principal mentioned the incident and my identity as, quote, "of Jewish heritage." I remember thinking of what I perceived as the principal keeping my Jewishness at a distance bothered me more than the student's behavior. To be honest, that student taught me the necessity for unconditional teacher love that I tried to pass on to my teacher credential students here. After 40 years of silence, my grandmother was willing to speak to students, first to my high school classes, then later to the classes of my education students at San Francisco State, where I taught before coming here. How hard this was for her is reflected in this story. I brought her to present to an 8th grade English class taught by one of my student teachers in San Francisco. As she began, she seemed to lose her composure and hesitate, which was very uncharacteristic of her. I took her out into the hall. "What's wrong, Min?" Through some held back tears, she never cried. She said, "I didn't know they would be so young. Why should they hear this?" It's a thread, sorry. It's just a thread that connects her and my mother and me and Davita. This mandate, in that moment, the mandate to protect vulnerable teenagers was more compelling to my grandmother than telling them the story of her pain and loss. In my later 20s, I joined second generation groups where I experienced marginalization as a German first Jew. One member whose family came from an Eastern European country said, "Well, your family probably didn't think anything would happen to them." I read Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust. I could only read a few pages at a time because my heart raced and I felt pain. As I read stories of my life mirrored in the lives of other daughters and sons of survivors. I recently reread the book, 2019 edition. Oops, sorry. There it is. To compare what I underlined then and now. In these pages of both versions, I underlined descriptions of Helen's father at dinner time that seemed painfully familiar. In 27 and 28, I interviewed my mother's mother, who spoke honestly about her survivor guilt before we had a name for that. In my early 30s, I married the son of a German Jewish refugee. I had a Jewish wedding and I raised 2 glorious children. My husband and I being careful to tell the Holocaust story consciously and deliberately, hoping to avoid or minimize third generation trauma. That second conversation, the 10-minute conversation with my father, has to this day left me with dark words. He would muse at dinner, "The best exercise I ever got was digging graves." And dark sounds, his frequent nightmares, and dark actions, how he screamed when we wasted food, his obvious fear of what we call in German die Behörde, or anything official, anyone in uniform. Even a Behörde that came in the mail, like official looking mail. Yeah. his fear of leaving this country, which he never did. Hamburg, to which I have returned 5 more times since age 23, while still a zweites Heimat, a second home, leads to weeks of sleepless nights as I approach the trip. The first 24 hours or more, sometimes paralyzed with fear that I won't be able to get out. Then horror that my children, even as adults now, have to see that. The thread from that conversation on the couch is fragmented and dark and unclear and raw and full of gaps and still hard to talk about. It's integrated into my identity in messy and uncomfortable ways. What we've been able to find out, though, from papers that my mother found after my father died and gave to me, and I'll just show you some documents on these next few slides. This is his passport, where you can see he tried to cross out the swastika. This is, oh, you can see it in English too. This is identification to prove he had been in a camp. It says here liberated concentration camp hospital in the year he was in there. He was arrested at the age of 17 or 18, I think, in 1944 by the Nazis, following his older brother's arrest and imprisonment for anti-Nazi actions. He was in solitary confinement. He was in solitary confinement for 6 weeks, I think, at this little prison. And then once they realized he was half Jewish, was transferred to Ohlsdorf and Neuengamme concentration camp, where he was for more than a year. He was indeed forced to dig mass graves. So I recently was looking at the immigration papers, and I noticed he immigrated on my birthday exactly 10 years prior, which I didn't realize. We went to see Neuengamme a few years ago. And so I pulled out the book again recently. It's a little strange, you know, when you go to camps in Germany, because and Davita will talk a bit about this. It has a museum quality, but it really doesn't, right? But right here it says Fußbüttel. So the prisoners who came to Neuengamme from Fußbüttel were engaged in Leichenbau on recovery of bodies. So that's how I figured out that that's what he had to do. His health, notably his eating problems, which may have stemmed from starvation and then from eating rich fatty foods too quickly after being released, were compounded his whole life by symptoms of PTSD. Picture. His brother was sent to Buchenwald. He also survived, but the way he coped with the effects could not have been more different. And that ultimately affected their relationship, I think, and my father's lack of trust in his brother. My father's father returned to Germany in 1948 and was embraced by the East German Communist government. He was given a house that later was returned to the rightful owners after Germany reunified. His efforts to rebuild a relationship with my father were understandably rejected. This picture is probably one of the most painful ones for me and my mother to look at, I think. You know, my father, who had been starved and no doubt beaten in a camp, is carrying on his thin shoulder my grandfather's suitcase, who stands there smoking a pipe. It's just really hard to look at. Yeah. His efforts to rebuild a relationship with my father were understandably rejected. An aside about this, can you see this? Yeah, just an aside about this page of a photo album from which 2 pictures are missing. My paternal grandmother wrote over 100 books, and he was pretty well known in the German Democratic Republic prior to reunification. After his death, his widow gave all his writings, documents, and photographs to the Akademie der Künste archives in Berlin. In 2019 and 2022, my son and I spent hours looking through these archives. When we came across this and other pages from a photo album with photos obviously missing, I remembered quite suddenly that in 1988, my husband and I visited Weimar. This was, again, a year before Germany's reunification. It's a whole other story about how we got there, but we stayed in the house where his widow lived. He had died. The house which was returned to the rightful owners, I already said that. My grandfather's wife was reluctant to let me take any pictures. So full of resentment that this man had abandoned my father as a child, leaving him to suffer in a concentration camp as a teenager, I got up in the middle of the night and took several pictures, including the 2 missing from this page. So a little vindication there. Yes. Both my grandfathers died when I was 12. I remember my father getting the letter informing him of his father's death. He cried briefly, but said nothing. My daughter and son have bravely here and compassionately tried to continue to piece together the story of our family, and more importantly, let those stories inform the kind of work they do and how they do that work. I'm not sure, honestly, that they had a choice in that. My daughter, as you heard in Stephen's introduction, started our grandchildren group and is becoming a gifted therapist working with teens and adults who have been traumatized. My son is becoming a lawyer for refugees and asylum seekers, and in his last year of college, as my mother mentioned, he researched what happened to my father's grandmother in Berlin, with whom he was close to as a child, with the goal of installing a Stolperstein for her. She died in Theresian. What my mother did not include is the story of what happened when my son and I went to see that Stolperstein for Regina Victor. Right after, okay, I have one more picture. No, that's not it. Anyway, right after we were looking at the Stolperstein, it was in front of her apartment building. We stood up and just was looking at the building, my husband and Mike and I, and a man who obviously lived in the building came home. And he said, "What's mom's here? What are you doing here?" And, I speak pretty fluent German. I explained to him what we were doing and what this was, although I assumed he knew. They're all over Berlin. And he got very angry and said, "Why should we have those here? My wife was killed by the Russians," I think he said, "and we don't have one for her." And it just went on and on and on. And I know if you speak other languages, in German, there's a formal and an informal way to address people, right? You, is it formal? I was very careful to refer to him as Sie and be very polite and very formal and respectful. But it kept going in circles. He was just very angry. And Micah whispers in my ear, "Mom, he's just going in circles. Let's just go." And right before we gave up trying to convince him this was okay, a woman comes out from her apartment above and starts screaming at him, saying, "You need to go back to school." She called him terrible names in German first, which I won't repeat. My husband really enjoyed learning them, but she yells at him and calls him these names and tells him, "Of course, this is our history and you need to go back to school." And so that was amazing, right? But then my son and I get on the bus and cry because he had worked so hard for this and this was not the greeting we expected. And I cried and could sort of hear my father's voice in my head saying, "You really can't go back." Even though, I think Dennis's mother said in the film last week that there are good and bad people everywhere, right? Like good and bad Germans. And that moment really kind of consolidated that too for me. Like it was him and then there was her, in the apartment. Before turning it over to Davita, I want to close by saying I remain not fully at home in either identity. Because, as I said earlier, the bicultural identity of German Jew doesn't exist anymore. I have German relatives I love, but even after seeing the Stolpersteine, this cousin on a recent trip asked, "Why exactly did your family leave Germany?" I love the language, but as my mother said, we hesitate to speak in front of other survivors or children of survivors. I love Germany, but read in horror about the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland Party, and of course feel even more horrified by the support recently expressed for the AfD by the Vice President of the United States. I learned enough about Judaism to raise our two children with holiday rituals and rites of passage, but Germany is still more a homeland than Israel ever could be. I was recently reading about diasporic identity, which for me defines an identity of the Jewish identity that travels and settles in a place for however long it's allowed to contribute and integrate. Perhaps the only place the German Jewish identities come together in a meaningful way for me is when I walk through Hamburg or Berlin and I see the Stolpersteine, or I'm sitting at a meeting with the Alliance members and the speakers and sensing the thread that connects us, the next generation. Elizabeth Brodsner, whose father survived Buchenwald, describes our experience well when she writes in her book, Survivor Cafe. "We keep trying to name what we are carrying, attempting to transform it into something beautiful, something healing, something that cannot quite be let go of, cannot quite be held onto. Even now, the notion of naming myself according to the near-death experiences of my parents strikes me as both a puzzle and a certainty." Thank you.
Hello. My name is Davita. I am the daughter of deepen, the granddaughter of Rena. I'm going to speak about my experience as a third generation descendant and the ways in which my understanding of what it means to be a grandchild of Holocaust survivors has shifted and taken new forms throughout my life and my education. I will start from the moment I first recall having some awareness of it until the present, and the way I attempt to understand it as I'm finishing up my doctorate degree in clinical psychology. I'll stop for a second. That's me with my grandma and my mom and my great grandmother. So we were 3 generations until I was 4.
No, 4
No,
generations.
4 generations, I'm sorry, until I was almost 3. Very special. So growing up as a young child and throughout elementary school, my mother never really spoke to us about the horrors and the death of it all. I do recall at some point having a vivid memory in my mind of the shack that my grandmother hid in. I pictured a dark wooden shack in a large field far behind a farmhouse. I pictured flowers all around it because my great grandmother, I thought, let my grandmother and her sisters plant them. I pictured shelves like bunk beds on the walls inside the shack where my grandmother and her sisters slept. I pictured my great grandmother sleeping on the floor with a small radio next to her. Of course, I do not know what the shack actually looked like besides what was described to me, but this was the image I had in my mind as a young girl, and it's in fact the image I still have today. I know my mother felt the importance of finding a way to begin to tell my brother and me about the story, but being the developmentally attuned mother that she is, and being so protective of us as she said, I am certain that she began by telling us only small portions of it. For many years, I think this was how I understood the Holocaust. I had some small idea of the story, but of course I didn't yet know the significance of it, let alone understand the ways in which it was deeply connected to me. The next moment I remember was in 8th grade honors English class. We were reading the diary of Anne Frank, and my grandmother came to speak to my class to tell her story. This was the first time she spoke to middle or high school students. By then, I knew a bit more about what had happened to my family, yet I don't think I was completely able to connect my family's story with the story that I was reading in Anne Frank's diary. How could I connect the chapters that I was assigned to read every night and subsequently write reflections on to my grandmother's story? I couldn't yet grasp at this age that they had both endured the horrors of the Holocaust, and that they were both in hiding, and that Anne didn't survive, and that my grandmother did, and that she was standing in front of me telling that story. It was too complicated and it was too deep to connect. Yet, while my grandmother was speaking, I have squeezed my tiny 8th grade body into a small desk chair with my friend Maddie, the only other Jewish girl in the class. Something in me knew I was supposed to be sitting close to the only other Jew. Maybe she was attempting to understand this part of our identity just as I was. The next moment was in my 10th grade world history class. So in my high school, it was important that you decorate your binder. Your binder was an expression of you. It showed the sport you played, the hobbies you enjoyed, the quotes that made you feel better, and the drawings of your favorite animated cartoon characters. My lime green binder, which my mother still has, was covered in drawings of flowers, Snoopy on his doghouse with a Woodstock, perched on him that my mom had showed me how to draw, positive affirmations and quotes about gymnastics since I was a gymnast for many years. I recall sitting in my 10th grade world history class and glancing down at my brightly colored binder, and then over to the desk of the boy sitting to my left and down at his dark black binder. There on the cover of his binder was the drawing of a swastika. I knew what that symbol meant by then. I understood that a high school boy in Germany would never risk the careless misuse of the symbol of this horror. He would recognize its profound potential to offend. While the boy at my high school with the swastika on his binder, boy, his conscience was clouded by ignorance and a lust for power angered me. He felt too little, and at this point in my understanding of it all, I think I was beginning to feel too much. The next moment was in my 10th grade honors English class. We were reading Elie Wiesel's Night. At this point, my mother had told us the story in more detail. For the class assignment, as we were reading Night, I decided that I was going to make a collage of images of old documents and tell my class what I then knew and understood of the story. I recall my mother using this opportunity as she handed me document after document to photocopy and glued to the large piece of cardboard to explain what happened in more detail, knowing that I was a bit more ready to hear it all. As she handed me documents, she translated them from German to English for me. I remember thinking, how could she have these documents? How could I be touching these papers after all these years? How could I be touching the same papers that my grandfather wrote on? How could these documents have survived? The large threefold poster that I created became covered in black and white documents, black and white and old documents, most of which had yellowed with age. There was a photo of the shack where my maternal grandmother, along with her two sisters and mother, hid in northern Germany for 2 years during World War II. One of the documents verified that my grandfather had been forced to dig mass graves in a labor camp. Also displayed was a picture of his passport with swastika on the front. It was evident that he had furiously scribbled over the swastika as if trying to erase the memory. The collage was titled Generation to Generation. I can recall my 10th grade classmates looking at me in disbelief as they understood how close I was generationally to the events of the Holocaust. After the presentation was over, the collage remained standing in front of the fireplace in the home where I was raised. My grandmother who survived and my father's mother escaped Europe in 1941, and my ancestors who had not were a living presence in our house long after the presentation. I knew fragments of their stories, yet what I came to understand later was that I was infused with an experience that was unformulated. It even defied knowing. The next moment was in 2012 when my family and I took a trip to Hamburg and Berlin. This was my first trip to Germany. My mother spoke about the stumbling stones or Stolpersteine, which, as you heard, are small brass bricks raised slightly above the ground so that one literally stumbles over them and looks. On this trip in June of 2012, instead of stumbling upon them as one is meant to do, my family and I came purposefully to an address in Hamburg where 2 of these brass stones, engraved with the names of my mother's great-grandmother and great-uncle, were placed. I tried to imagine my great-grandmother watching as the Nazis forced her mother and her mother's great-grandmother. I tried to imagine as my great-grandmother watching as the Nazis forced her mother and her brother into a truck to be taken away forever. Though the reading of the stone should have only taken a few seconds, we felt compelled to remain there for several minutes, knelt over the stones, looking at them, touching them, and feeling the loss of what they represented. I stood by as I watched my mother bend over to touch the stones wet with rainwater and imitated her gestures, as if we were both cradling the stones, the people, and the memories. I remember thinking then that history really had passed through me and that the Holocaust was both a historical and a very personal event. And I realized that I was in a physical place, which confronted me directly with the history of my family, a history that I had until then only understood through the distance of books, stories, and pictures, and that despite the horror of the past, some part of me belonged in this place. During the same trip in the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, I observed how the other visitors viewed the displays with solemn respect. Yet they had headsets on and shopped in the gift shop and chatted about which site they would visit next. While my brother and I took in the reality of this history that was ours, and noticed that my mother and her discomfort rushed through it. We were not afforded the luxury of viewing the displays from a distance as though we were in an art museum. The stories we knew and the feelings associated with them prevented that degree of detachment. I did not anticipate that this trip would become a marker on my path of understanding my historical and my cultural identity as a Jew and as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. While I had by this time heard stories about my grandparents and great-grandparents and integrated those stories into my schoolwork as I spoke about, I had never walked where they had walked. I had never experienced their story in the visceral way I did when I went to Germany. Posing for photographs earlier in front of the children's home in Hamburg, where my grandmother and her sisters lived following the war, was a moment of incongruity for me. We posed like tourists because the building that had sheltered over 200 lost and grieving children had become a site in a guidebook. Although here, the life my still living grandmother had lived was on display for tourists, I had to respect that these places functioned for Germans as a public forum for grieving, an acknowledgement of the obvious historical burden that they carry, and an explicit owning of the responsibility for the events of the Holocaust. I think this was the first time I began to deeply think about my identity as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Their stories of perseverance and survival amongst prolonged oppression have been passed down to me. And I remember taking on this new way of thinking about them, having this deep-rooted and incredibly proud feeling of obligation as the youngest woman in my family. I wanted to learn every aspect of their stories, to retell their stories at every opportunity, and to eventually pass them down to the next generation. I think this experience, this trip, had a profound impact on who I am. And I recall thinking that moving forward in my life through college and into adult roles, that I would take this history with me. And that I, as a descendant of the victims of this horror, felt as though I was obligated to live the life that they could not, to pursue the education that they could not, and to make the choices that they could not. The next moment was during my first year of college. I was enrolled in a Holocaust and film class. The assignment was to watch a Holocaust film and write a reflection on it. I recall lying in bed, my laptop propped up on my knees and turning it on. Within the first 10 minutes, black and white images of the Gestapo hoarding hundreds of Jews into tiny square buildings, images of frail, terrified Jews being forced to line up as the Gestapo yelled in their faces, images of the gas chambers and Jews digging graves. I remember slamming my laptop and bursting into tears and running to say to my mother, "This is what happens?" Of course, by then I knew about the concentration camps and the gas chambers and about the 6 million Jews that died, but being asked to watch a film about it, as though it was just history, as though it wasn't my family's history, I couldn't bear it. I didn't have the ability to separate myself enough from the images to continue watching the film, let alone write about what I saw. I dropped the course. My younger brother, as my mom said, is finishing law school. He hopes to work with refugees and asylum seekers. He spent a semester during his undergrad in Berlin and then returned again for a month to spend time reading through my family's archives as he wrote his honors thesis about the Judenreise. My brother, the brilliant and brave man that he is, has taken more of a historical direction in attempting to make sense of the horror. He has sought to find answers in the historical research and perhaps seeks to find healing and repair and redemption of life in helping refugees. Anytime we're with my grandmother, my brother asks her questions about her story and her family's history. He knows exactly what to ask and how to ask it, and he listens with such presence and intensity and can connect every detail to the next one and piece it all together as she talks. I'm in awe of my brother and the way he can approach it, while I cannot bear to look much into the historical detail of it all. Maybe I don't want to know that much. Maybe I don't want to face the details of the atrocities against the Jews and against my family. Maybe it feels too unbearable. For me, now, my attempt to make sense of it all feels very different, especially since I began graduate school in fall 2020. Since then, I've really attempted to understand the ways in which the Holocaust has impacted my ancestors, my grandmother and her family, and her descendants psychologically, and attempt to make sense of the remnants of trauma within each of us. So during my graduate studies in psychology, I've tried to begin with the help of my parents to develop a more three-dimensional understanding of the impact of the transmission of historical trauma. These ideas have really begun to help me understand the incomprehensible. Writers, theorists, psychologists, and researchers have tried since World War II to define the trauma that survivors themselves experience. The book, Emotional Inheritance by Galit Alice, talks about the legacy of trauma and asks, how do we inherit, hold, and process the things that we don't remember or didn't experience ourselves? What is the weight of that which is present but not fully known? We inherit family traumas, even those we have not been told about. The inherited feelings of the parents and the grandparents' unprocessed traumas are phantoms that live within inside them, the ghosts of the unsaid and the unspeakable. It is those ghostly experiences, not quite alive but also not quite dead, that we inherit. They invade our reality in invisible ways. They loom in, leaving traces. We know and feel things we don't always recognize their source. After World War II, psychoanalysts first began examining the impact of trauma from one generation to the next. Many of these analysts were Jews who had escaped Europe or whose parents were Holocaust survivors. Later, the children of these trauma survivors carried unconscious traces of their ancestors' pain. In the 1970s, neuroscience validated psychoanalytic findings that survivors' trauma, even the darkest secrets they never talk about, had a real effect on their children and grandchildren's lives. In the 1990s, studies were focused on epigenetics, in which they analyzed how genes were altered in the descendants of trauma survivors and studied the ways in which the environment, especially trauma, leave a chemical mark on the person's genes that is then passed down to the next generation. Other studies reveal that Other studies reveal that offspring of Holocaust survivors have higher levels of cortisol, a hormone that helps the body bounce back from trauma. Yet it was found that descendants of people who survived the Holocaust have different stress hormone profiles than their peers, predisposing them perhaps to anxiety disorders. This leaves them more vulnerable to hearing symptoms of trauma, even those they did not experience firsthand. In a New York Times article called "The Holocaust Grandchildren Are Speaking Now" that was published to coincide with the movie A Real Pain, the authors write about the experience of the third generation, stating, "They know something is important to them and affected them, and it's their story too. But they're not aware of the things they didn't experience and are almost hesitant to take ownership." Psychologist Sam Gershon writes, when speaking about intergenerational trauma, that Holocaust descendants often feel like they are possessed by a history they did not live, or feel like they're mourning a loss that is not their own. Currently, I've discovered that much of what was experienced by my relatives has been shrouded in silence, numbing, and fog. I spent time in my childhood, I think, looking for shapes in the fog. And I now know that trauma can cry out to be known and at the same time resist being known. The effects of the Holocaust reverberate through my family. It lives in the air that we breathe. These concepts have provided a lens through which I think I can now better understand my family's past and present and future. Viewed through this lens, stories of family discord, emotional difficulties, and the toll of interminable stress have new meaning. I think it's in essence a thread that connects me as a clinician and as a person to my family's lived history, and it's a legacy of both harm and resilience. I think now it's impossible to really draw a completely solid line from my family's history and experience of the Holocaust to my development as a psychologist. But what I do know is that doing this work feels like a moral imperative. I think I feel driven to repair or redeem life in some way. In my clinical work, when working with patients, I try and strive to relate to my patients' pain and find meaning in their disguised and incomplete stories. The lead atlas describes that as psychologists, we try to follow the signs and listen to not only what our patients say, but also their pauses, attempting to collect remnants of their childhood of what was said or done, listening to omissions, to stories untold, looking for clues, piecing them together into a picture and asking ourselves, what really happened and to whom? The secrets of the mind include not only our own life experiences, but also those we unknowingly carry with us. The memories, the feelings, the traumas that we inherit from previous generations. With new meaning comes expanded personal freedom and agency. And because of my family's history, I think I know the importance of doing the work that I'm going into. And I now approach my career in clinical psychology with a found determination and commitment to it. So thank you so much for listening.
Okay, let me change the camera view. So as always, we have gone late, but we do have some time for questions and answers. As always, right of first question belongs to students in the course or students from our sister institution, SRJC. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Mindy from the DC. You said that your dad couldn't go back to Germany. Was that something that he could not go back because of how he felt, or was he actually banned from going back for?
I think it was both.
Is my divorce.
I think he was very frightened. There's a complicated piece to his post-immigration story that we haven't entirely figured out, and that he came here in 49 and then helped my mother and grandmother get here again in 61. And he was drafted right in the Korean War. And that was the last thing, right, he could manage to do. So what we think happened is that he refused and was told he couldn't become a citizen. So he was a permanent resident, he had a green card. It's a tragedy because, he was very politically engaged, and we went to rallies and things and marched to protest the Vietnam War. You know, so that was a tragedy for him, but I think he could have probably traveled safely, but he was much too scared to leave this country. I mean, I'm so glad he's not alive now. I'm sorry to say, watch what's happening to so many people in this country. I think
Can't hear you. Yeah.
he lived constantly with the fear that he would be sent back, and it probably wasn't real. I don't know about the psychological part. I'm sure that was a huge part. He just never talked about it. You think? anything else?
Yeah. Sam. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm a part of this class. You talked about, how you have seen in Germany, like, they're trying to keep the history alive almost as a way to like, you know, not make up for it, but, you know, like,
Own it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Have you seen like the opposite? People trying to like hide it and like pretend it didn't happen because of.
I mean, a little bit. It's interesting you say that because my mother's sister is more, when she goes to visit the non-Jewish cousins who are there, she's far more overt, I would say, in talking about the insisting that they talk about the Holocaust. I think, right? I think we just go along with being with them and try to enjoy the time, and we don't force the conversation. What my aunt does, and that has led to some estrangement, I think, with my cousin, in fact, in 2022, sitting with their cousins. You know, they said to me, why does she always have to, you know, bring this up? Right? So I'm kind of in the middle, like, why does she have to bring it up? Well, because it defines our life, right? And it defines our existence to some degree, so it's interesting you have that question. So that's first, I can't think of it's happened other times. Where you feel like the Germans say you're talking too much about it.
But I think that it has happened, and I think a few times it has happened that you know consciously that the people you're with, they don't really want to go into the history, they want to be reminded. And it's mostly one out by that, one doesn't want to bring it down.
I mean, the fact that we can't know about their answer tells you how hard it is. We go back to Hamburg and we're just with them. You know, the identity is cut in half, kind of, if that makes sense. And even I have sort of a sister kind of person. I mean, we were exchange students together in high school and we stayed in touch. She lives in a small town in northern Germany, and I hear from her over the holidays, and she'll still write me, Ariana. She'll still write, hope you had a lovely Christmas. I mean, there's no sort of connection to Jewishness either, and we're not religious, but we do celebrate Hanukkah. She can't make room for any of them. It's as though she and our cousins and her generation cousins and the daughter, who's my generation, it's as though we only exist in that kind of circle with them. That's the image. They can't make room for the history. Yeah, like we're only the Germans with them. They can't make room. In fact, I remember Eric saying to you, I remember my mother's cousin saying to her, we had to also hide or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
and save. But they lost lives too.
Sure.
But not from the same. But it is like I think they jumped like
Yeah. And there was my grandfather, my non-Jewish grandfather, her father had many siblings, and there was one or in-law, brother-in-law who
had joined the Nazi party. My father was so horrified, he never let his person back into our house.
And he wouldn't let my grandmother in their house.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
I have a question.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Juliana. I have a question for me. As a survivor, how do you see
As a survivor, how do you see the impact is talking about your story often? Does it help with the trauma?
Does it help me with the, it's, I'm not so sure. It also stirs it up, all the memories, but it's probably a bit of both. I think it is helpful and it's very important to me. My family, after all, history, but it does stir things up, and I feel sometimes a bit brave and easy. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, she does, the last 17 years, there are years she's done 10 or 12 presentations in the schools in a year. It's a lot. Last year was 700 students. I probably push it a little bit because we all think it's important for teens to hear it.
Right.
And we really treasure, like, their reactions. Other speakers know this too. The questions she gets, the fact that, like, afterwards, you remember what it felt like, what it was like to be a teenager, or you have teen siblings and, like, you don't know what to do with all the intensity of the emotions inside you. So afterwards, they won't be able to ask questions in front of each other sometimes, but they'll just come up and, like, make a circle around her. I mean, it's amazing. It sort of does touch her. These 3 girls said, "Where did you get your necklace?" I mean, it's not even, it doesn't even matter that they don't ask questions about the history. They just want to connect with someone who lived the history, right? Most touching thing ever.
Other questions? Yeah, Andrea.
Was there a time, I mean, you were very young in much of this, was there a time of sort of your most frightening moment? And then was there a time when you had the sense that you were safe and you were free? Or was it all kind of blurred together?
No, I don't think I really ever felt safe until many years later. Even as a young child, children feel this, something was not right. I was very close to my mother, and I could sense that she was suffering. And I mean, she tried, I'm sure, to shield us from the knowledge, but it was there, and I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. No, it's difficult, and
So I don't know. Was there a moment when you felt safe?
okay, that was a question. I don't think I felt safe ever during those years because, there was a bombing. I mean, our life wasn't anything normal. And I mean, our father was gone for 4 years. I didn't, and my mother, had to deal with losing her own family and trying to take care of 3 children. And then we were in hiding, and it just wasn't a normal life. And I sensed that, something was wrong. I knew that, but I was too little to understand what it was. And so I hope it answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and talking about this.
Oh, of course. Thank you.
Fine, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Claire. I wanted to ask about the experience of being tattooed with the numbers. I grew up in New York, born in 1959, and there were still quite a few people around with the numbers tattooed. That's how I first became aware of the Holocaust. So do you find that it's a big issue?
Well, the numbers were in concentration camps. We never were. And as a child, I wasn't aware of that. I'm sure let's try to shield us, but there was a lot of fear, the fear that someone was going to come And yeah, just in addition to the fear of the bombing that kept the bombs kept coming and the shock you into another reality. Really, it was.
I don't think we ever saw anybody with the number. Wasn't it? I mean,
No, not in.
You know, my parents didn't have many friends growing up, but we, the friends who would come over were also survivors.
Right.
They had been in Teresa and Charlotte.
Yes.
And my uncle lived in Buchenwald. I don't think any of them had numbers. I think it was more people in Auschwitz, right?
Yes.
That's an interesting phenomenon, by the way.
Yes.
I mean, when I spend time, as I do with so many children of survivors, we a lot of us share that our family didn't have our parents didn't have a lot of friends growing up or a social life per se. The people who they were with were other survivors. And even the fact that my parents married, I think they were 15 years apart. Was a common thing too. That we have a speaker in our group who talks about her parents meeting. They were teenagers. They both got out of a camp and they met in a house where several happened to be living in a small town in Poland after the war. And then that's how her parents met and married. I don't think that was so uncommon. It's just staying with survivors because it's very hard to talk to anyone else probably. I feel like you could have a relationship with, other people.
Sydney,
Like going off of what you just said, is that
louder, please.
a kind of how you met your husband? Because you mentioned he was also a child of
Well,
survivors.
that's a long story. And
my husband or her husband?
mine.
Wait, whose husband?
I was thinking yours.
Got married again. Isn't that great? Yeah. Saying.
Well, I knew Susan's father, the man I married. Our families were very close. His mother and my mother were the best of friends. His mother actually sheltered us for a time. We lived with
We
her.
mentioned her. There was a picture of them together.
Right, they were very good friends. And my husband, my first husband, his older brother was a friend of Hans Singer, my mother's brother. Was killed at age 21 on when they were young. They were very good friends, and the family were close. But my mother didn't even know there was another brother, the one that I married later. Yeah. So that's how we got to know each other.
Are you asking about that or?
I think she's asking about how you.
Both.
Both?
Also,
Well, my husband's sitting here and we were just telling someone how we met. So I'm actually not going to tell you that story because it's really silly and as those stories are, but
Raising his hand.
but I think it is interesting. I don't know how much. So my mother-in-law was born in Frankfurt in 27, 33. She fled they fled to France.
Belgium and then
France. And then as the Nazis invaded France, they fled to Portugal and she was able to get to the US in 41. Same age as my mother though, 12. They were about 10 years apart. Yeah, she was about 10 years older. We just lost her 2 years ago, but she was also 12 when she got here. But it's an interesting question you asked because whether we met because of that or have that connection, I think it is significant. You know, although his upbringing was much different than mine. He knew he was Jewish. He was raised in a Reform household. His grandparents spoke Yiddish and they were present. Yeah. But he hasn't researched the story as much.
very interesting.
My brother and I recorded.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so, yeah, my dad's mother passed away now.
2023.
Oh my gosh, 2023, and yeah, so my brother and I recorded her story. So we have that, yeah.
Yeah.
That was really.
You know, I mentioned I did an interview with my mother's mother when I was 27, so quite a long time ago. And I've spent the last, I mentioned it to Professor Bittner too, that I've spent the last year listening to this cassette. It's an old cassette, right, from 1987. And like that one side, I can't hear much at all. The other side's really hard to hear. I'm trying to figure out how to get it digitized, but I've listened to it about 10 times trying to catch what I can. And it's phenomenal. I mean, she was silent for 40 years, 40 years. And then I become a German teacher at 20 something, and she decides she's going to speak, and she comes to my class, and the first thing she does is scold a boy who comes in late with a bloody knuckle, got in a fight at lunchtime. I'm like, that's not why you're here, but somehow it segued into violence, and that's what she was like. But it was just phenomenal. Then she spoke to my college students, but why am I telling you this? When I listen to that tape, I think, how after 40 years of silence, she was completely articulate and wise and talked about what we would have called survivor guilt and how she couldn't believe she was the only one except this one cousin. Like, why her? But she still pulled me as a child to the front of lines. Wells Fargo, everywhere.
Listen, we are out of time. So thank you.